Have you ever heard of a war so pointless, so utterly senseless, that it almost feels like a bedtime story? Not the kind with grand heroes or earth-shaking battles, but one where the only real conquest was confusion itself. Welcome, dear listener, to a quiet corner of history. One where the battles are less about glory and more about absurdity. Tonight, we embark on a journey through some of the most dumbest invasions ever recorded. Wars that didn't redraw maps, didn't crown kings, and often didn't even make much sense. Imagine armies marching with purpose, only to find their enemy was not a rival nation, but something far more unexpected. Perhaps a stubborn pig, a wooden bucket, or even a flock of birds who had no interest in surrendering. These are not the stories of heroic conquests or sweeping victories. No, these are tales where confusion, miscommunication, and sometimes just plain bad luck took center stage. And in their quiet futility, they remind us that not every battle needs to be won to be worth remembering. So, settle in. Let the slow rhythm of these stories wash over you like a gentle tide. Let's drift together through history's most pointless invasions, where the only real conquest might just be your curiosity. Now picture this. Soldiers, rifles ready, boots marching in perfect unison. They prepare to face a fierce enemy, only to discover their opponents are birds. Not just any birds, but emus. Large, fast, and surprisingly clever. You might think this sounds like the start of a joke. But this war was very real, and it didn't end the way anyone expected. This is the kind of story that makes you wonder, what were they thinking? And more importantly, why? Why dumb invasions matter. History often celebrates the grand and the glorious, the battles that change the course of nations. But tonight, we turn our attention to the quiet corners, the wars that barely changed a thing, except perhaps the patience of those involved. These invasions, while seemingly pointless, offer us a unique window into the human experience. They show us how pride, misunderstanding, and sometimes sheer stubbornness can lead to conflict, even when the stakes seem small or absurd. And as we explore these stories, I invite you to relax, to listen closely, and maybe even to smile quietly at the strange ways history unfolds. Our first tale takes us far from the battlefields of Europe or Asia, to the sunburnt plains of Australia in the early 1930s. Here, a very unusual war was about to begin, one that pitted man against nature in a way few could have imagined. The enemy? Emus, large, flightless birds known for their speed and stubbornness, and the soldiers, armed with machine guns, ready to defend their crops. It sounds almost too strange to be true. But as we'll see, this war was as real as any, and its outcome was, well, let's just say, unexpected. So, if you're still with me, prepare to meet the emus, the unlikely victors of what some have called the most senseless war in history. But before we dive into their story, take a deep breath, relax, and let the gentle rhythm of history carry you forward. The Great Emu War, when birds outsmarted soldiers. Now, dear listener, let us wander far from the dusty archives of Europe and into the sunburnt plains of Western Australia. It is the year 1932, a time when the world was still recovering from the Great War, and farmers were struggling to make a living in the harsh Australian outback. But this is not a story of human hardship alone. No, this is a tale of an unlikely enemy, one that wore feathers instead of uniforms, and whose battlefield was the vast wheat fields. Welcome to the Great Emu War, a conflict so peculiar, so utterly senseless that it has become a legend of futility and irony. Picture this: thousands of emus, large flightless birds native to Australia, migrating after their breeding season. These birds, standing nearly 6 feet tall with long legs built for speed, descended upon the newly cultivated wheat farms of Western Australia. To the farmers, these emus were not just birds. They were invaders. They trampled crops, devoured precious grain, and threatened the fragile livelihoods of men and women who had already endured drought and economic hardship. The government, eager to protect its farmers and their harvest, decided to take action. But not with scarecrows or fences. No, the solution was far more dramatic. The war begins: soldiers versus emus. In November 1932, the Australian military was called in. Armed with machine guns and a sense of grim determination, soldiers set out to combat the emu menace. Imagine the scene. Soldiers in khaki uniforms, rifles, and Lewis guns at the ready, facing a flock of birds that seemed utterly unconcerned by their presence. One might expect a swift victory, but the emus had other plans. You see, these birds were fast. Very fast. They scattered and regrouped with surprising intelligence, dodging bullets and frustrating the soldiers at every turn. The military soon found that their weapons, designed for human conflict, were ill-suited for chasing down nimble birds across open plains. The campaign's comical failures. Reports from the front lines were like a comedy of errors. Machine guns jammed, soldiers missed their targets, and the emus continued their feast undeterred. At one point, a group of soldiers attempted to ambush the birds, only to find that the emus had simply split into smaller groups and escaped. The birds' speed and agility turned the tables. The soldiers, instead of conquering, were being outmaneuvered by creatures with no interest in war. It was a war where the enemy didn't even know it was fighting. You might be wondering, how long did this war last? And who, if anyone, emerged victorious? Well, the answer might surprise you. The war lasted several weeks, with sporadic skirmishes that achieved little. In the end, the emus won. The soldiers withdrew, the birds continued their march, and the government was left to reconsider its approach. What makes the Great Emu War so fascinating is not just the failure of military might, but the sheer absurdity of the situation. Here we have a modern army equipped with machine guns, defeated by birds who were simply following their natural instincts. It's a reminder that not all battles are fought on human terms, and that sometimes nature has its own plans. And perhaps in that defeat, there is a quiet lesson about humility and the limits of control. So, as we drift through the rest of this story, let's remember, the Great Emu War was not about glory or conquest. It was about stubborn birds, confused soldiers, and a world that sometimes makes little sense. Before we move on, here's a little secret. Despite the loss, the Great Emu War sparked a new respect for these birds. They became symbols of resilience, and their story has been told and retold, not as a tale of defeat, but as a gentle reminder of nature's quiet power. But our journey through dumb invasions is far from over. Next, we'll travel to a tiny island in the Pacific Northwest, where a border dispute was sparked not by armies, but by a single pig. Yes, a pig. And the story that follows is just as curious, just as slow, and just as strangely human. So, if you ever feel overwhelmed by the battles of life, remember the emus, running fast, unbothered, and always a step ahead. Let the image of those emus, running free and unbothered, be a gentle comfort as you settle deeper into the quiet night. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let the next story carry you further into the curious world of history's dumbest invasions. The Pig War, a border dispute fueled by a hog. As we continue our gentle journey through history's most senseless invasions, let us move from the sunburnt plains of Australia to a small, quiet island nestled between the United States and Canada. Vancouver Island, 1859. A place of towering forests, misty shores, and a pig. Yes, you heard that right. A pig. Not a cannonball, not a battalion, but a single, rather unfortunate pig. This is the story of the Pig War, an invasion sparked not by armies or empires, but by a hog with the taste for potatoes. Picture the scene. Two nations, the United States and the British Empire, both claiming sovereignty over the San Juan Islands. The border was unclear. Tensions simmered quietly, but no shots had been fired. Then came the pig. On June 15, 1859, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler found a British-owned pig rooting through his potato patch. Annoyed, he shot the pig. What followed was a diplomatic disaster wrapped in absurdity. The British demanded compensation for the pig. The Americans refused. Words were exchanged. Troops were sent. Suddenly, what began as a simple property dispute escalated into a full military standoff. Imagine soldiers from both sides stationed on a tiny island, facing each other across a narrow channel, waiting for orders that never quite came. For months, they stared, drilled, and prepared for battle, all over a pig. And to add to the comedy, no shots were fired, except the one that ended the pig's life. The war that wasn't, a study in patience. The so-called war lasted 13 years, though it's debatable if it was ever truly a war at all. No battles, no casualties, just soldiers standing guard, occasionally playing cards or fishing, while politicians debated the fate of the islands. The pig, of course, was long gone. In the end, the dispute was peacefully resolved through arbitration, with the islands awarded to the United States. What makes the Pig War so captivating is its sheer senselessness. A conflict born from a pig's appetite, prolonged by human stubbornness, yet resolved without violence. It's a story that reminds us how sometimes the smallest things can spark the greatest tensions, and how patience, diplomacy, and perhaps a bit of humor can prevent senseless bloodshed. So, as you listen, let the image of soldiers standing watch over a potato patch, guarding against pig-related invasions, bring a gentle smile to your lips. Let the slow unfolding of this story be a lullaby of human folly and peaceful resolution. Before we leave the Pig War behind, consider this. Despite the long standoff, no one remembers the generals, the soldiers, or the politicians. But the pig? The pig's story lives on. Sometimes it's the smallest players who leave the biggest marks on history. Next, we journey to medieval Italy, where two rival cities went to war over a wooden bucket. Yes, a bucket. And the tale that follows is just as dumb, just as strange, and just as quietly fascinating. Now, take a deep breath. Relax, and let the next story carry you gently onward. The War of the Oaken Bucket, when a bucket sparked a battle. As we continue our gentle voyage through history's most senseless invasions, let us travel back to medieval Italy, to the year 1325. A time of knights, castles, and a wooden bucket. Yes, a bucket. Not a sword, not a crown, but an oaken bucket. Plain, simple, and yet, somehow, the cause of a full-scale war. This is the tale of the War of the Oaken Bucket, a conflict between the rival city-states of Modena and Bologna, whose rivalry was as old as the hills and as fierce as any battlefield. Imagine two proud cities, each fiercely protective of its honor and independence. Modena and Bologna were neighbors, separated by a river, but divided by centuries of rivalry. Trade disputes, political intrigue, and old grudges simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a spark. And that spark came in the most unlikely form: a wooden bucket. The bucket incident, a prelude to war. The story goes that Modenese soldiers sneaked into Bologna under cover of night and stole a bucket from a city well. Now, you might wonder, why steal a bucket? Was it a symbol of power? A trophy of conquest? Or simply a prank gone too far? The truth is, no one knows for sure. But what followed was a declaration of war. The Modenese proudly displayed the stolen bucket as a trophy, while the Bolognese seethed with outrage. What followed was a series of skirmishes and battles, none particularly large or decisive, but all fueled by pride and the desire to reclaim honor. The war dragged on for months, with soldiers marching, banners flying, and commanders plotting. Yet, through it all, the stolen bucket remained the symbol of the conflict, a reminder that sometimes wars are about more than land or gold. It's almost poetic, isn't it? That a simple household object could ignite such passion. You may be asking yourself, how did this war end? Did the bucket ever return home? And what became of the soldiers who fought over it? Well, dear friend, the war ended with Modena victorious, the bucket safely in their hands, and the rivalry. Well, it continued as rivalries often do. The bucket itself was preserved and is said to still be on display in Modena today. A wooden testament to a war fought over something so ordinary. It almost makes you smile. The War of the Oaken Bucket reminds us that human pride can turn even the smallest things into symbols of great importance. It's a quiet lesson in how history is often shaped not just by grand events, but by the little moments that capture the imagination. And perhaps it's a reminder to not take ourselves too seriously, even in matters of war. So, as you listen, picture those soldiers marching under banners, not for gold or glory, but for a wooden bucket. Let that image settle gently in your mind, a soft smile accompanying the slow unfolding of this curious tale. Next, we'll journey to the shortest war in history, a conflict so brief, it lasted less than an hour. A war where the guns barely had time to cool before peace was restored. But that story, like all the tales, has its own peculiar charm. Before we leave the War of the Oaken Bucket behind, consider this. While empires rose and fell around them, the people of Modena and Bologna fought over a bucket, a symbol of their stubbornness, their pride, and their shared humanity. Sometimes it's the smallest stories that reveal the biggest truths. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let the next story carry you gently onward. The Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war in history. As we continue our slow drift through history's most senseless invasions, our journey takes us to the sunny shores of East Africa, to a place where the ocean breeze carries whispers of empire, intrigue, and a war that lasted less than an hour. Welcome to Zanzibar, an island rich in history, culture, and, as we shall see, one of the shortest wars ever recorded. It was the morning of August 27th, 1896. The British Empire, at the height of its global reach, faced off against the Sultanate of Zanzibar in a conflict that would last a mere 38 minutes. Yes, you heard that right. 38 minutes. Less time than it takes to watch a television episode's opening credits. Zanzibar, a jewel of the Indian Ocean, was a vital hub for trade routes between Africa, India, and Europe. By the late 19th century, it had become a British protectorate, meaning the Sultan remained the figurehead, but the British held the real power. The British interests were clear: control of trade, suppression of the slave trade, and maintaining influence in a region coveted by competing European powers. For years, Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini, a man favorable to British interests, ruled peacefully. But when he died suddenly in August 1896, the delicate balance of power was about to be tested. Enter Sultan Khalid bin Bargash, the late Sultan's nephew. Ambitious and determined, Khalid seized the palace and declared himself Sultan, without British approval. The British, unsurprisingly, were not pleased. They had their own preferred candidate, Sultan Hamud, who was more compliant with their interests. So, the British issued an ultimatum. Khalid must step down and leave the palace by 9 a.m. on August 27th. Khalid's response? He barricaded himself inside the palace, rallied around 2,800 defenders, and prepared for a fight. The war begins, a brief but decisive battle. At precisely 9:02 a.m., when the ultimatum expired, British warships in the harbor opened fire. The HMS Raccoon, Thrush, and Sparrow unleashed a bombardment on the palace, quickly disabling the Sultan's artillery and setting the building ablaze. Within minutes, The royal yacht HHS Glasgow and 2 smaller vessels were sunk. The defenders, despite their numbers, were overwhelmed by superior British firepower. By 9:40 a.m., the Sultan's flag was shot down. The palace was in ruins, and the war was effectively over. You might wonder, what happened to Sultan Khalid? How did he escape? And what became of Zanzibar after this lightning-fast conflict? Well, Khalid fled the burning palace and sought refuge in the German consulate, eventually escaping into exile. The British installed their preferred sultan, Hamoud bin Mohammed, who ruled loyally under British guidance. And Zanzibar? It remained a British protectorate for decades, its fate tied to the ebb and flow of British Empire. The Anglo-Zanzibar War stands as a stark reminder that sometimes wars are less about long campaigns and more about swift displays of power. A conflict so brief that it challenges our very notions of what war means. 38 minutes, a blink in history's grand timeline, yet a moment that echoes through the ages as the shortest war ever fought. So, as you listen, picture the calm harbor suddenly filled with the thunder of naval guns, the palace aflame, and a sultan fleeing into the shadows. Let this story settle gently in your mind. A brief flash of conflict in a world often marked by long, drawn-out struggles. Next, we will explore another curious conflict, one sparked by a football match, where passion on the pitch spilled over into the battlefield. But for now, take a deep breath, relax, and let the quiet waves of history carry you onward. Before we move on, consider this. In less time than it takes to brew a cup of tea, an empire demonstrated its might, a palace was destroyed, and a war was won. Sometimes history's most profound moments come in the briefest of flashes. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale of senseless invasion. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The football war. When a game sparked a conflict. As we continue our gentle journey through history's most senseless invasions, we now find ourselves in Central America. In the year 1969, a time when 2 neighboring countries found themselves on the brink of war, sparked by something as simple and as passionate as a football match. Welcome to the Football War, also known as the 100-Hour War, a brief but bloody conflict between El Salvador and Honduras that began not with armies clashing on distant battlefields, but with fans cheering and sometimes jeering on the pitch. Imagine the tension in the air. El Salvador and Honduras, 2 countries sharing a long and complicated history, were competing for a spot in the 1970 FIFA World Cup. The stakes were high, but the rivalry went far beyond sport. Years of economic hardship, land disputes, and social tensions simmered beneath the surface, ready to ignite. When the teams met for the first match in Tegucigalpa, Honduras's capital, the atmosphere was electric and hostile. Salvadoran players were met with jeers, stones thrown at their hotel windows, and a crowd determined to unsettle them. Honduras won the first match 1-0, but the unrest was only beginning. A young Salvadoran woman, distraught over the loss, tragically took her own life, a heartbreaking symbol of the deep emotions tied to this rivalry. A week later, the teams met again in San Salvador. This time, the Honduran players faced similar hostility: rotten eggs, dead rats, and angry crowds. The Salvadoran team won 3-0, but tensions escalated beyond the stadium. The final deciding match took place in Mexico City, a neutral ground. The game was intense, ending 3-2 in favor of El Salvador after the extra time. While the players fought for victory on the field, the real battle was brewing off it. Riots broke out. Diplomatic ties were severed, and within weeks, soldiers crossed borders. The war, a brief but deadly conflict. The football war lasted just 4 days, but its cost was high. Thousands of lives lost, tens of thousands displaced. It was a conflict born from decades of tension, ignited by the passion of sport, and fueled by national pride. A war where the roar of the crowd was replaced by the thunder of artillery. It's ironic, isn't it? That a game meant to unite people could instead divide them so fiercely. The football war reminds us how deeply intertwined sport and identity can be, and how quickly passion can turn to conflict. And yet, even in this chaos, there is a human story, a story of hopes, fears, and the longing for recognition. So, as you listen, picture the stadiums filled with cheering fans, the tension thick in the air, and the slow, inevitable slide from celebration to conflict. Let this story settle gently in your mind, a reminder of the strange and sometimes senseless ways history unfolds. Next, we will explore a war sparked by an even smaller cause: a single ear. Before we leave the football war behind, consider this. While the goals were scored on the pitch, the real score was written in the lives forever changed by a conflict that began with a game. Sometimes the most senseless invasions start with the simplest sparks. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The War of Jenkins' Ear. When an ear sparked a decade of conflict. Now, dear friend, we sail back to the 18th century, to a time when the oceans were highways of empire, and the Caribbean was a chessboard for European powers. It is here, in 1739, that we find one of history's most oddly named conflict, the War of Jenkins' Ear. A war that, despite its comical title, lasted nearly a decade and cost thousands of lives, all sparked by a single severed ear. Imagine the British brig Rebecca, captained by Robert Jenkins, sailing through the Caribbean waters in 1731, carrying sugar from Jamaica to London. The ship was stopped off the coast of Havana by Spanish coast guards, suspicious of smuggling. What followed next was an incident so brutal and bizarre that it would echo through history. Captain Jenkins was reportedly forced up the mast by a rope around his neck, then thrown down into the ship's hold. And then, in an act that would become infamous, a Spanish officer cut off Jenkins' left ear with a cutlass. The severed ear was preserved, some say pickled in a jar, and later presented to the British Parliament as a symbol of Spanish cruelty. You might wonder, was this ear the true cause of war? Or merely a convenient excuse for deeper tensions? The answer lies in the tangled web of 18th century mercantilism, colonial rivalry, and the fierce competition for control of trade routes and territories. Britain and Spain had long been at odds over their claims in the Americas, and the ear incident was the spark that ignited a powder keg. The war unfolds, skirmishes and strategies. From 1739 to 1748, Britain and Spain clashed in the Caribbean and in parts of North America. The war saw naval battles, sieges, and raids, most notably the disastrous British attack on Cartagena in 1741, which resulted in heavy casualties. On land, fighting centered around disputed territories in Florida and Georgia, where British colonial forces, led by General James Oglethorpe, defended against Spanish incursions. Despite fierce fighting, the war achieved little in terms of territorial gains. It's ironic, isn't it, that a war named after a severed ear, a symbol of personal injury, would become a drawn-out conflict with thousands of casualties. The War of Jenkins' Ear reminds us how personal grievances can be magnified into national conflicts, and how the symbols we choose, like an ear in a jar, can shape public opinion and political will. So, as you listen, picture Captain Jenkins holding his severed ear, presenting it to Parliament with the words, "I commend my soul to God and my cause to my country." Let that image settle gently in your mind, a quiet emblem of how history often turns on the smallest, strangest moments. Next, we will explore another curious conflict, one that involved a sticky disaster rather than a battle. But for now, take a deep breath, relax, and let the slow waves of history carry you onward. Before we move on, consider this. While the War of Jenkins' Ear ended with little change in territory, it set the stage for future conflicts and shaped colonial power struggles for decades. Sometimes the smallest injuries leave the deepest marks. Now settle in and prepare for the next tale. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The War of the Stray Dog. How a chase sparked a war. In October 1925, on the tense borderlands between Greece and Bulgaria, two neighbors whose relationship was already fragile, simmering with old grievances and territorial disputes. And yet, what ignited a brief but real military clash was not a grand political move, nor a battle plan, but a stray dog. Yes, a dog. A four-legged wanderer who, quite unknowingly, became the catalyst for a conflict sometimes called the War of the Stray Dog. picture a Greek soldier stationed at the border near the Demir Kapia Pass, watching over the rocky terrain and quiet forests. Suddenly, his dog breaks free, dashing across the invisible line into Bulgarian territory. Instinctively, the soldier chases after the dog. Just a few steps, perhaps, but enough to cross into enemy land. Bulgarian sentries, tense and alert, see this movement and, fearing an intrusion, open fire. The soldier is shot. A tragic, confusing moment, one that would soon spiral far beyond the fate of a single man or a stray dog. You might wonder, how did a single shot lead to a war? And what happened to the dog, the unwitting instigator of this crisis? Well, the dog's fate remains a mystery, lost to history, but the consequences of that moment were anything but small. The Greek government, led by General Theodoros Pangalos, saw the shooting as proof of Bulgarian aggression. They demanded an apology, compensation, and punishment for those responsible. When Bulgaria expressed regret and proposed a joint investigation, Greece refused, escalating tensions. The invasion, Greece marches into Bulgaria. With a 48-hour ultimatum ignored, Greek troops crossed the border on October 22, 1925, occupying the town of Petrich. Skirmishes broke out between Greek and Bulgarian forces, casualties were sustained, and the fragile peace shattered. Yet, despite the seriousness of the conflict, it was born of a misunderstanding, an accidental border crossing in pursuit of a dog. The War of the Stray Dog stands as a peculiar testament to how fragile international relations can be. A single moment, a stray animal, and the tension of decades boiled over into armed conflict. And yet, it was also a story of restraint. After intervention by the League of Nations, the fighting ceased, and diplomacy prevailed. The League brokered the Petrich Agreement, ending the hostilities and ordering Greece to compensate Bulgaria for damages. So, as you listen, picture the soldier chasing his dog, the sudden crack of gunfire, and the slow, heavy march of armies into a small border town. Let this story settle gently in your mind, a reminder of how even the smallest things can have outsized consequences, and how sometimes peace is found not on the battlefield, but in the quiet halls of diplomacy. So as you drift toward sleep, carry with you the gentle lesson of these stories, that even in the chaos of conflict, there is room for humility, for humor, and for hope. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The Toledo War, a border dispute over a swamp. As we drift deeper into history's most dumb invasions, our journey now takes us not across oceans or through ancient empires, but to the young United States of America in the early 19th century. It is the year 1835, a time when states were still defining their borders, when maps were more suggestion than science, and when pride was often louder than reason. This, dear friend, is the story of the Toledo War, an almost war between Michigan and Ohio. Not over riches, not over empire, but over a narrow strip of swampy land where mosquitoes buzzed louder than cannons ever did. Imagine a conflict where the soldiers carried muskets but fired almost no shots, where the prize was not a glittering city but a patch of marshland, and where the loudest casualties were bruised egos, wounded pride, and perhaps a few unlucky trees cut down in anger. It is, in every sense, a lullaby of absurdity. A war that never really was, yet somehow shaped the future of two states. Setting the scene: rival neighbors. Let us begin with geography. At the edge of Lake Erie lies the Maumee River, winding its way through wetlands and empty forests. To the north, Michigan Territory, young, ambitious, eager for statehood. To the south, the established state of Ohio, equally ambitious and fiercely protective of its borders. Between them lay what became known as the Toledo Strip, a ribbon of land some 8 miles wide and 50 miles long. At its heart sat the small but strategically placed town of Toledo. Little more than a scattering of cabins and muddy streets, but destined to be the center of controversy. The trouble, you see, began with maps. The original survey of the land, made hastily after independence, was imprecise. One line placed Toledo within Michigan's bounds. Another, equally official, placed it in Ohio. Both sides clung to their version of the map, both convinced that history and justice were on their side. And as so often happens, what began as lines on paper soon became marching men on muddy roads. The first sparks of dispute. By the mid-1830s, Ohio wanted to develop the Maumee River as a commercial route. Michigan, still a territory, saw the same land as key to its future prosperity. Neither was willing to step back. When Michigan applied for statehood, it insisted the Toledo Strip was rightfully its own. Ohio, unwilling to lose, blocked Michigan's admission to the Union until the dispute was resolved. It might have remained an argument of lawyers and surveyors, but human pride has a way of turning quiet disagreements into noisy confrontations. In April 1835, Michigan's young governor, Stevens T. Mason, sometimes called the boy governor, for he was only 24, ordered his militia to patrol the strip. Ohio responded by sending its own surveyors, guarded by sheriffs and armed volunteers. One spring morning, Michigan militia intercepted the Ohioans, chased them off, and arrested several. The so-called Battle of Phillips Corners had begun. No lives were lost. Only one Ohio man was slightly wounded by the butt of a musket, not its barrel. A war of words and warrants. From there, the conflict grew more comical than catastrophic. Ohio judges issued warrants for the arrest of Michigan officials. Michigan courts responded in kind, issuing warrants for Ohio officials. Imagine the scene. Lawyers and sheriffs crossing paths in muddy fields, brandishing papers of authority instead of sabers. A battle of parchment with more ink spilled than blood. Each side raised militia. Thousands of men mustered, uniforms polished, muskets loaded. Yet when they marched toward the disputed land, they mostly waited. They camped. They drilled. They stared across swamps at men who looked very much like themselves. In taverns, the soldiers swapped stories. In fields, farmers shook their heads. And in Washington, the federal government sighed, watching two of its children bicker over a patch of land few outsiders cared to visit. Though remembered as bloodless, the Toledo War did claim one unfortunate victim. In July 1835, in a scuffle near Toledo, an Ohioan named Tu Stickney, son of a prominent settler, stabbed a Michigan sheriff with a penknife during an arrest attempt. The sheriff survived, though his dignity did not. The knife wound was shallow, but the embarrassment ran deep. It is perhaps fitting that the sole injury of this war was not delivered by sword or musket, but by a penknife. A conflict born of paper maps and legal disputes was fated to draw only the smallest of blood. By the autumn of 1836, the farce had run its course. The government, weary of the quarrel, stepped in to settle the matter. The decision? Ohio would keep the Toledo Strip. Michigan, in exchange, was granted the Upper Peninsula, a vast stretch of forest and rock most at the time considered useless. The people of Michigan were outraged. To lose Toledo, their small but treasured prize, and to gain instead a wilderness of wolves and pine trees seemed an insult. Yet history would prove otherwise. For while Toledo grew into a modest industrial city, the Upper Peninsula revealed riches of copper and iron ore, resources that would fuel Michigan's prosperity for generations. What seemed a bitter defeat was, in time, an unseen gift. So, dear friend, the Toledo War ended not with trumpets or treaties signed beneath chandeliers, but with a weary compromise brokered in Washington's corridors. No great battles were fought. No cities burned. Only pride was wounded, and perhaps a sheriff's shoulder. And yet, this curious conflict lives on in memory. Not for the land it won or lost, but for the simple truth it reveals. That even in young nations, where maps were still fresh and futures uncertain, human pride could spark a war over a swamp. A war where mosquitoes may have bitten more soldiers than musket balls ever did. And perhaps, in that absurdity, lies a quiet comfort. For if wars must exist, let some be as harmless as this. Before we leave the Toledo War behind, imagine those young militiamen, boots muddy, muskets slung, waiting for orders that never came. Imagine the maps spread on tavern tables, lines argued over by candlelight, while frogs croaked loudly in the swamps outside. And smile at the thought that sometimes the fiercest battles are fought with words, not weapons. Next, we journey to another strange story. A conflict not over swamps or pigs or buckets, but over pastries. Yes, pastries. A war where a baker's grievance would draw nations into quarrel. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you gently onward. The Pastry War, when a dessert sparked a conflict. As we continue our quiet drift through history's most dumb invasions, we leave the muddy swamps of America behind and turn now to 19th century Mexico. A land of deserts and mountains, of revolution and empire, of passions that often boiled over. And yet, the conflict we visit tonight was not sparked by crowns or empires alone. No, dear friend. This one began with something far sweeter, far simpler. A pastry. Yes, you heard correctly. Not a cannonball, not a crown, but a pastry. And from that small complaint grew what became known, half in jest, half in earnest, as the Pastry War. In the year 1828, Mexico, newly independent from Spain, was still finding its footing. The streets of Mexico City bustled with life, but also with unrest. Rebellions were common, soldiers and mobs clashed, and businesses were caught in the chaos. In one such skirmish, a French pastry chef named Monsieur Remontel saw his little shop ransacked by Mexican soldiers. His ovens were smashed, his shelves overturned, and his delicate tarts and pastries, symbols of his craft, were trampled under boots. He demanded compensation. The Mexican authorities, overwhelmed with larger troubles, dismissed him. And so he appealed to France. At first, the claim seemed trivial, a baker asking a nation to avenge his pastries. But France, ever mindful of its citizens abroad, took note. And when other French merchants added their own grievances, demands for unpaid debts, claims of mistreatment, the pastry shop became the symbol and the rallying cry. By 1838, years after the original incident, King Louis-Philippe of France had grown weary of Mexico's refusals. The pastry chef's complaint, once a single voice, had become part of a chorus. France issued an ultimatum. Mexico must pay 600,000 pesos in compensation, an enormous sum, far beyond the losses of any bakery. Mexico, already drowning in debt, refused. And so, with the pride of nations at stake, the ships began to gather. In November of 1838, a French fleet sailed to the Gulf of Mexico and blockaded the port of Veracruz. War over pastries and pride had begun. Picture the scene. The quiet Gulf waters dotted with French warships, their black hulls and tall masts looming over the shoreline. The cannons, once meant for battles of empire, were now trained on a young republic for the sake of a baker's grievance. On November 27th, the French opened fire. The fortress of San Juan de Ulua thundered in reply. Smoke rose above Veracruz, the sound of cannon echoing across the water. For 4 days, Mexico resisted. Soldiers fired from crumbling walls, civilians fled through narrow streets, and the harbor filled with the acrid haze of gunpowder. But against French firepower, the outcome was inevitable. By December, Veracruz had fallen, its defenses shattered. And so, the pastry war claimed its first victims. Not soldiers of empire clashing for glory, but ordinary Mexicans caught in a quarrel that began with sweets. Yet the war was far from over. The French blockade strangled trade, and Mexico, desperate to resist, found an unlikely champion. Its young general, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Yes, the same Santa Anna who only 2 years earlier had lost Texas after the Battle of San Jacinto. Proud, theatrical, and ever eager for a stage, he seized the chance to redeem his reputation. Leading a counterattack on Veracruz, Santa Anna was struck by French grape shot and lost his left leg. He would later hold grand funerals for the limb, treating it as a national martyr. It was, perhaps, the only heroic moment in a war otherwise filled with irony. Eventually, under the watchful eye of Britain, peace was restored. Mexico agreed to pay compensation, though far less than France demanded, and the French fleet withdrew. The war had lasted only a few months. Yet its legacy lingered, not in territorial change, nor in great treaties, but in memory. A pastry shop reduced to rubble had brought cannons to Veracruz. A baker's grievance had tangled empires, and a general's lost leg became a relic of national pride. So, dear friend, the pastry war remains one of history's most curious tales, a conflict that reminds us how small grievances can swell into storms, how pride can transform crumbs into cannons. And perhaps it is a quiet lesson in proportion. For when we lose perspective, even a pastry can become a powder keg. As you imagine those streets of Veracruz, the scent of sugar long faded, the echo of cannons drifting away, allow yourself a soft smile. A smile at the strangeness of human quarrels and the reminder that sometimes our battles say more about our pride than our needs. Before we leave the pastry war behind, picture Monsieur Remontel, the baker at the center of it all. Perhaps he smiled at last, knowing his losses had been avenged. though surely even he could not have imagined the scale of the storm he had stirred. Next, our journey will take us northward once more, to the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where nations clashed not over pastries, but over fish. Yes, fish. For in the mid-20th century, Britain and Iceland would wage a series of curious conflicts known as the Cod Wars. Battles of boats and nets, where the prize was not land, but the right to catch cod in icy seas. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you gently onward. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale of senseless invasion. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The Cod Wars, when fish caused a battle. As our slow voyage through history's most dumb invasions continues, we leave behind pastries and cannons and sail northward into colder waters. The North Atlantic, gray and restless, where icy winds bite and gulls wheel endlessly over the sea. It is here in the mid-20th century that we find a curious conflict. Not a clash over crowns or empires, but over fish. Yes, fish. Cod, to be precise. This, dear friend, is the story of the Cod Wars. When Britain and Iceland, two nations separated by distance and scale, faced off not with muskets or battalions, but with fishing boats and Coast Guard cutters. A war where the fiercest weapons were nets, and the battlefield was the open sea. It sounds almost comical, doesn't it? Yet these disputes, stretching across 3 decades, reveal much about pride, resources, and the strange ways nations choose their battles. Let us begin with Iceland, a small island nation adrift in the North Atlantic, where winters are long and the land yields little. For centuries, the sea was Iceland's provider. Cod was not just food, it was survival, trade, lifeblood. By the 1950s, Iceland's population was barely 150,000, yet its economy was tied almost entirely to the sea. Every catch mattered. Every cod was a piece of the nation's future. But the waters around Iceland were also coveted by others. For British trawlers, massive ships with steel hulls and sweeping nets, the fishing grounds near Iceland were rich and irresistible. And so, a question of boundaries arose. How far did Iceland's waters extend? Where did its rights end, and Britain's begin? It was a matter of maps and treaties, but also of pride and survival. In 1958, Iceland unilaterally extended its fishing limit from 4 miles to 12 miles offshore. For Icelanders, this was essential protection. For Britain, it was an outrage. British trawlers had long fished just beyond the old limits, and now they were being told to turn back. The response? Britain dispatched Royal Navy frigates to escort its fishing fleet, patrolling the cold waters with gray steel and white wakes. Iceland, in turn, sent small Coast Guard vessels, sturdy but dwarfed by the Royal Navy, armed with determination more than firepower. For weeks, the ships played a strange game of cat and mouse across the seas. Coast Guard cutters cut nets. Trawlers weaved evasively. Navy destroyers loomed, their guns silent but their presence undeniable. And yet, through it all, not a single shot was fired. The Cod War, as it came to be called, was less a war than a ballet of steel on the sea. Ships circling, maneuvering, posturing, while the cod swam unaware below. But the story did not end there. In the 1970s, Iceland again pushed its fishing limits, first to 50 miles, then to 200 miles. Each time Britain protested, each time the trawlers sailed and the Royal Navy followed. By now, the clashes grew more physical. Icelandic patrol boats developed a new weapon, the trawl wire cutter. Imagine a ship racing alongside a British trawler, dropping a blade into the sea and slicing through the thick cables that dragged its nets. For the trawlers, it was financial ruin. For the Icelandic Coast Guard, it was defiance. The British Navy responded with forceful escorts. There were collisions, deliberate and accidental, as steel hulls scraped and crashed on the rolling waves. Photographs from the time show ships side by side, their crews glaring, waves crashing against iron plates. Still, despite the noise and fury, there was restraint. Cannon muzzles stayed cold. No sailor was lost to enemy fire. By the late 1970s, after years of standoffs, Britain conceded. The 200-mile limit stood. Iceland's small nation had faced down a great naval power and secured its lifeblood. It is a curious tale, isn't it? Two allies in NATO, facing the threat of the Cold War together, yet locking horns over fish. Britain, with its empire fading but pride intact. Iceland, small but unyielding, willing to risk it all for cod. A war where the prize was not land or glory, but the right to catch fish in icy seas. And perhaps there is something quietly human in that. For nations, like people, sometimes fight most fiercely for the things that sustain them day by day. So, dear friend, the Cod Wars remind us that conflict is not always grand or catastrophic. Sometimes it is petty, even comical, yet still deeply important to those involved. Picture it: sailors bracing against salt spray, shouting across decks, nets snapping in the waves, while far below the cod swim on, untouched by human pride. It is a story of steel against wood, of pride against survival, and of the quiet truth that even small nations can stand tall when their future is at stake. Before we leave the Cod Wars behind, imagine the scene. The gray Atlantic stretching to the horizon, British frigates towering over tiny Icelandic cutters, their crews staring at one another across the waves. No shots, no blood, only the slow rhythm of waves and the stubbornness of nations. Next, our journey will return to the 19th century, to the rolling hills of America's Midwest, where a curious dispute erupted not over fish, but over honey. Yes, honey. For in 1839, Missouri and Iowa nearly went to war over bee-filled trees and border lines. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you gently onward. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale of senseless invasion. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The Honey War, when bees sparked a border dispute. As we continue our gentle voyage through history's most senseless invasions, we now return to the rolling prairies of 19th century America. A land of wide rivers, tall grasses, and borders that were often more imagination than reality. In 1839, two states, Missouri and the newly formed Iowa Territory, were about to stumble into a conflict. Not over great cities, not over gold, but over a line on a map. And 3 trees filled with honeybees. This is the story of the Honey War, an almost war where the loudest casualties were pride, and where the only real sweetness came from the honey itself. In the years after American independence, borders were drawn quickly, often with limited surveys. Rivers shifted, maps disagreed, and lines on paper rarely matched the reality on the ground. Between Missouri and the Iowa Territory lay such a line, the Sullivan Line, drawn in 1816. Some believed it ran one way, others another. The disputed strip of land was about 9 miles wide, stretching across quiet farmland, woodlands, and rivers. For decades, settlers in this strip paid little attention. They farmed, raised livestock, and tended their orchards. Life was simple until Missouri claimed the taxes they owed. Iowa, equally insistent, refused. And so what had been a sleepy boundary suddenly became the stage for a most peculiar quarrel. In the autumn of 1839, Missouri tax collectors arrived in the disputed land. They demanded payment from settlers who replied that they owed their allegiance not to Missouri, but to Iowa. Tempers flared. Voices rose. And then came the fateful incident. A Missouri sheriff, in an effort to collect something, anything worth value, seized 3 bee trees belonging to a local settler. Inside these hollow trunks were stores of honey, rich and golden, carefully tended by bees and prized by the farmer. When the trees were cut down and the honey taken, outrage buzzed louder than the bees themselves. The settlers cried foul, Iowa's officials protested, and soon the quarrel escalated beyond reason. It was no longer about maps. It was about honor and honey. Missouri called out its militia. Several hundred men, rifles slung, drums beating softly as they marched toward the disputed strip. Iowa, unwilling to yield, raised its own force of volunteers, equally determined to defend their land. Picture it: 2 militias trudging through the cold of December, coats wrapped tightly, breath clouding in the frosty air. Each side dug in, camped, and waited. Soldiers sharpened bayonets, but also whittled wood, told stories, and shared food around fires. There were stares across the line, but few shots. The only real battle was with the weather, as icy winds swept the prairie and snow dusted the barren trees. At one point, Missouri soldiers reportedly arrested an Iowa sheriff, while Iowa troops vowed revenge. For days, both sides exchanged heated words, but little else. And so the honey war became less a clash of arms and more a comedy of stubbornness. Farmers worried for their crops. Soldiers grumbled in the cold. And politicians, far away, argued loudly about maps and lines most had never seen. In truth, the bees had more sting than either army. Finally, the government intervened. Washington, anxious to avoid bloodshed between its own states, ordered both militias to stand down. The dispute was sent to the courts, where the matter was settled not by musket or sword, but by legal judgment. In 1849, a decade later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Iowa's favor, establishing the true border where it remains today. The honey, of course, was long gone by then. So, dear friend, the honey war reminds us of the strange things that can spark human conflict. 3 bee trees, heavy with honey, toppled by an eager sheriff. From that act came militias, marching bands, and the threat of war. Yet in the end, no lives were lost, no battles fought, no cities burned. It is a story both sweet and silly, a reminder that sometimes our quarrels say more about our pride than our needs. And perhaps, as you picture those cold December camps, with soldiers huddled by fires while bees slept soundly in their hives, you might smile softly at the thought of it all. A war where the honey mattered more than the land. Before we leave the honey war behind, imagine the taste of that golden sweetness dripping from combs, cherished by farmers and fought over by states. Next, we will journey eastward once again to the forests of Maine, where lumberjacks, loggers, and proud politicians clashed in another curious conflict, the Aroostook War. A war where axes and trees, not armies and cannons, set the stage. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you gently onward. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale of senseless invasion. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The Aroostook War, when lumberjacks nearly went to war. As our journey through history's most dumb invasions continue, we now move into the deep forests of North America in the 1830s, a place where pine trees reached toward the sky, rivers cut through the wilderness, and men in flannel shirts swung axes from dawn to dusk. This, dear friend, is the story of the Aroostook War, a conflict not over kings or crowns, but over lumberjacks. Yes, lumberjacks. It is a tale where the clatter of axes and the crash of falling trees grew louder than cannons, and where the only true battles were over who had the right to cut wood. After the American Revolution, the border between the United States and British Canada was left vague, particularly in the dense forests of northern Maine. The maps drawn in distant offices showed rivers and lines that did not always match the wild, untamed land. As settlers moved into the Aroostook Valley, farmers, trappers, and most importantly, lumberjacks, the question of whose land it truly was became harder to ignore. Was this forest part of Maine, belonging to the young United States? Or was it part of New Brunswick, under the British Crown? The answer, as often happened, depended on which map you looked at. And so, where there was wood, there was also pride. And soon there was trouble. In the winter of 1838, rival lumber crews from both sides moved into the disputed valley. American lumberjacks felled trees by the frozen Aroostook River. Canadian crews arrived, axes sharp, equally determined to claim the timber. At first, the confrontations were words, gruff voices, thick accents, muttered insults. But soon, arrests were made. A Canadian lumber crew was seized by American authorities. New Brunswick responded in kind. The forest grew tense. Men watched each other warily, axes in hand. And the world's strangest war was underway. By early 1839, the situation escalated. Maine called out its militia, hundreds of men trudging north through the snow, boots crunching on frozen ground. New Brunswick raised its own forces, equally determined. Picture it. 2 militia, wrapped in wool and fur against the bitter cold, building wooden blockhouses deep in the forest, as though preparing for a grand battle. But no great clash ever came. Instead, soldiers found themselves cutting firewood, guarding piles of logs, and watching the snow fall quietly around them. In truth, the lumberjacks remained the real warriors, chopping trees by day, drinking and boasting by night, while soldiers waited endlessly in the cold. So, dear friend, The Aroostook War reminds us of how human pride can turn even the quiet work of lumberjacks into a cause for armies. A war where the prize was timber, where the battlefield was a frozen forest, and where the soldiers saw more snow than enemies. It is a story both strange and soothing, a reminder that sometimes the fiercest disputes end not with cannon fire, but with treaties and tired diplomats. And perhaps, as you picture these snowy camps, smoke rising from chimneys, men huddled for warmth, you might smile softly at the thought of it all. A war that was fought more with saws than with swords. Before we leave the Aroostook War behind, imagine the lumberjacks in their heavy coats trudging home through the snow, carrying stories of a war that was more talk than battle. Next, we travel far from America's forests to the jungles of Southeast Asia, where a peculiar quarrel arose not from maps or timber, but from something far more unusual: a leopard skin. Yes, dear friend, a leopard skin. In the 19th century Burma, a dispute over a sacred pelt would set tribes and kingdoms at odds, in what history remembers as the War of the Clouded Leopard. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you gently onward. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale of senseless invasion. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The War of the Clouded Leopard, when a pelt sparked a clash. As we continue our slow journey through history's most dumb invasions, we leave the snowy forests of Maine behind and enter the humid jungles of 19th century Southeast Asia. It is here, in the lush valleys of Burma, today's Myanmar, that a quarrel arose. Not over land, not over gold, not even over borders, but over something far stranger. A leopard skin. Yes, dear friend, a leopard skin. A sacred pelt. Prized by one community, desired by another, and destined to set tribes and kingdoms on a path toward conflict. This is the story of the War of the Clouded Leopard, an invasion so curious, so unnecessary that it now rests quietly among history's strangest tales. In the early 1800s, Burma was a land of dense forests, swift rivers, and tribal kingdoms. Many of these tribes held strong beliefs about the animals around them. The clouded leopard, a rare, elusive cat with beautiful, spotted fur, was seen by some as sacred. To the Shan people of the hills, a leopard's skin was not just a pelt. It was a symbol of authority, a sign of prestige, even a talisman of spiritual power. Chiefs wore it across their shoulders during ceremonies, believing it connected them to the jungle itself. When one such sacred pelt was stolen or perhaps traded poorly, accounts differ, the seeds of a quarrel were sown. One side demanded its return. The other refused. Pride flared, and soon a sacred relic had become the cause of war. The disputed leopard skin had passed into the hands of a rival group, who displayed it as a prize. To its original owners, this was theft, sacrilege, and humiliation all in one. Messengers were sent, demanding its return. Their words were ignored. Small raids followed, men slipping through forests, arrows drawn, trying to reclaim what they saw as theirs. But the pelt remained stubbornly in the possession of the rival tribe, guarded with almost comic determination. And so the matter climbed upward. From a quarrel of hunters to the attention of chiefs, and then to the courts of kings. By the mid-19th century, the Burmese monarchy itself became entangled. Reports of tribal disputes reached the capital, and the king, keen to assert his authority, sent troops to settle the matter. Imagine it. Soldiers in traditional dress, armed with spears and muskets, marching into dense forests where parrots squawked and cicadas buzzed. What were they fighting for? Not territory, not conquest, but a leopard skin. Skirmishes broke out in the hills. Villages were raided, bamboo forts defended, and hunters fled deeper into the jungle. Yet, for all the noise and movement, the casualty lists remained small. The fighting was scattered, brief, and often ended in standoffs beneath the trees. In truth, the jungle itself was a fiercer foe than the enemy. Soldiers fought leeches, fever, and rain far more than they fought each other. Eventually, after months of unrest, the matter was resolved in the simplest of ways. A new leopard skin was offered, blessed by shamans and chiefs, to replace the disputed one. It may not have been the exact pelt that began the quarrel, but it was close enough to soothe wounded pride. The soldiers withdrew, the villages returned to their rhythms, and the jungle swallowed the echoes of conflict. So, dear friend, the War of the Clouded Leopard reminds us of how fragile human pride can be. A sacred pelt became the spark for raids, for soldiers marching, for treaties and negotiations. And yet, in the end, the solution was as soft as the fur itself. Simply replace what was lost and let the quarrel fade. It is a story that is absurd and strangely comforting, for in its futility, it shows us that even when humans clash, there is always room for resolution, however small. And perhaps as you picture that jungle, mist rising over trees, birds calling in the distance, you might smile at the thought that all this commotion was over the skin of a single leopard. Before we leave the clouded leopard behind, imagine its soft spotted pelt draped across a chieftain's shoulders, carried not as a prize of war, but as a symbol of peace. Next, our journey will take us to Europe once again, where a single city and its misplaced pride sparked one of the strangest wars of all, the War of the Bavarian Succession, sometimes remembered as the Potato War. A conflict where soldiers marched and camped, but fought more with hunger than with weapons. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you gently onward. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale of senseless invasion. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The Potato War, when armies fought more over food than land. As we drift further into history's most dumb invasions, we now return to Europe in the late 18th century. A continent of kings and emperors, of alliances and rivalries, where great battles often reshaped maps and thrones. But not this one. This, dear friend, is the story of the War of the Bavarian Succession, better remembered by its more humble nickname, the Potato War. Yes, potatoes. A war where armies marched, cannons were hauled into the hills, and soldiers dug trenches. Yet little blood was spilled. Instead, the greatest casualties were crops and cooking pots, as hungry men raided fields for food. It is a tale of posturing, of pride, and of potatoes. In the year 1778, The ruler of Bavaria had died without an heir, and his lands became the object of dispute. The Habsburgs of Austria, ever eager to expand their empire, laid claim to the territory. But Frederick the Great of Prussia, sharp-eyed and quick to check Austrian power, opposed them. Soon, alliances were drawn. Prussia stood firm. Austria gathered its troops. And so, two of Europe's great powers prepared to clash over the inheritance of a duchy. The stage was set for another continental war. Yet what followed was not thunderous battles or sweeping conquests, but months of maneuvering, where the soldiers found themselves more occupied with feeding themselves than fighting their foes. In the summer of 1778, Austrian and Prussian armies marched into Bohemia. Muskets gleamed, cavalry rode proudly, and cannons rattled along muddy roads. Yet when the armies finally faced each other, neither side dared commit to a decisive battle. The risks were too high, the terrain too difficult, and the prize too uncertain. And so the armies dug in. Camps were built, fires lit, and soldiers waited. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, as each side stared across fields at the other, unwilling to make the first move. It was here that hunger crept in. Supply lines faltered. Wagons of grain ran thin. Soldiers, restless and underfed, turned to the fields around them. Potatoes, simple and abundant, became the true prize of the war. Armies spread through villages and farms, digging up crops, raiding barns, and stripping orchards of their food. Farmers watched helplessly as their fields vanished into cooking pots. And so, instead of cannons roaring, the hills echoed with the scrape of shovels in soil and the bubbling of stew pots. The War of the Bavarian Succession became the Potato War, an invasion where food mattered more than fighting. To be sure, there were moments of tension. Small skirmishes erupted on forest paths. Patrols fired scattered shots across rivers. But these were brief, hesitant, and rarely decisive. For all their size and power, the armies never clashed in full battle. They marched, they camped, they ate, and eventually they withdrew. By the time winter set in, it was clear that no great victory would be won. Hunger had done more to shape the campaign than any general's plan. In May of 1779, diplomacy achieved what armies could not. The Treaty of Teschen was signed, bringing the war to an end. Austria gained a small piece of territory, Prussia secured its influence, and Bavaria passed into the hands of another branch of its ruling family. But the soldiers? They returned home with stories not of glory, but of empty bellies, muddy camps, and endless potatoes. It was, in every sense, a war of waiting, where the greatest energy was spent digging in fields rather than fighting in them. So, dear friend, the Potato War stands as one of history's strangest conflicts. A war fought not with the thunder of battles, but with the rumble of stomachs. A reminder that even in Europe's grand age of empires, not every war was crowned with glory. Some were crowned with hunger, boredom, and the stubborn pride of kings unwilling to admit defeat. And perhaps, as you imagine those weary soldiers sitting by campfires and boiling potatoes in battered pots, you might smile softly at the thought. A war where the food was more memorable than the fighting. Before we leave the Potato War behind, picture the quiet hills of Bohemia, where two great armies once faced each other in silence, separated not by musket fire, but by steaming bowls of stew. Next, we will journey to Central America, where a conflict arose not from crops or maps, but from a single watermelon. Yes, dear friend, a watermelon. For in Nicaragua in the mid-19th century, a soldier's careless act with a piece of fruit would spiral into a riot, and from riot into battle. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you gently onward. Now, settle in and prepare for the next tale of senseless invasion. Slow, strange, and utterly human. The Watermelon War, when fruit sparked a riot. As we continue our quiet journey through history's most dumb invasions, we now arrive in Central America in the mid-19th century. The air is warm, the streets are lively, and in the marketplace, fruit sellers call out their wares: bananas, melons, papayas. It is here in 1856 that a quarrel erupted not over crowns or conquests, but over a piece of fruit. A watermelon. Yes, dear friend, a watermelon. A single act of carelessness, or perhaps arrogance, sparked a riot that would spiral into days of fighting. And though it has faded quietly into history, it remains one of the most unusual sparks for violence ever recorded. In the mid-1800s, Nicaragua was a land caught between rival ambitions. Foreign mercenaries, local factions, and weary townsfolk all lived uneasily side by side. At the heart of this tension was the town of Granada, a hub of trade and culture, where travelers and soldiers mingled with merchants and farmers. It was in this bustling town square under the hot midday sun that the story of the Watermelon War began. One warm afternoon, a group of foreign soldiers, some say American filibusters, others say sailors, wandered into the marketplace. Hungry and restless, they stopped at a fruit stall. There, a large watermelon sat on display, its green rind glowing in the sunlight. One soldier, without paying, seized it. He cut a slice, ate it, and tossed the rind casually to the ground. To the vendor, a Nicaraguan man who had worked hard for his meager earnings, this was not just theft. It was humiliation. He protested. Voices rose. The soldier laughed. The crowd, already wary of foreign presence, bristled. And then, as so often happens, a single careless act became the spark for chaos. Within minutes, the marketplace erupted. Townspeople hurled insults, then stones. Soldiers drew weapons, trying to push back the crowd. What had begun as a quarrel over a watermelon became a brawl, and soon spilled into the streets. More townsfolk joined in. More soldiers arrived to support their comrades. Muskets were raised. Shots rang out. By nightfall, the quiet town square had become a battlefield. Though no great armies clashed and no generals devised grand strategies, the violence spread for days. Shops were looted, barricades built, and the town divided between soldiers and citizens. All because of a piece of fruit. When the dust settled, the damage was done. Several people were dead, many more injured, and the fragile peace of the town was broken. The foreign soldiers withdrew, nursing their pride. The townspeople, though scarred, returned to their routines. But the story lingered, passed from voice to voice, retold as both tragedy and comedy. So, dear friend, the Watermelon War reminds us how fragile human tempers can be. A single watermelon, taken without care, grew into riots and bloodshed. It is a story that is absurd and sobering. Absurd because of its humble cause. Sobering because of the very real lives caught in its wake. And perhaps, as you picture that marketplace, fruit stalls lined with melons, the hot sun overhead, the murmur of a crowd, you might smile gently at the thought, while also reflecting on how easily pride can overturn peace. A war not for land nor gold, but for a watermelon. Before we leave the watermelon war behind, imagine the sweetness of the fruit, dripping in the midday sun, and the strangeness of a world where such sweetness became the cause of conflict. Next, our journey will take us to the Eastern Mediterranean, where a goat, yes, a goat, wandered where it should not, and set neighbors against one another in yet another of history's senseless invasions. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the marketplace fade and prepare to drift onward into the curious tale of the Goat War. The Goat War. When a wandering animal sparked a clash. As we drift further into history's most senseless invasions, we leave behind the markets of Central America and sail toward the sunlit shores of the Mediterranean. It is here, in the early 20th century, among rocky hillsides and olive groves, that a quarrel arose not from politics or power, but from something much simpler: a goat. Yes, dear friend, a goat. A wandering creature with no knowledge of borders or treaties managed to spark what came to be called the Goat War, a small, almost comical clash that reminds us how fragile peace can be when pride is involved. On the island of Cyprus in the years before the Second World War, tensions simmered quietly between communities divided by culture, language, and pride. The hillsides were dotted with small villages where shepherds tended their flocks and goats wandered freely along stone terraces. It was a land where borders were sometimes little more than invisible lines across a rocky field, and where disputes often began with something as small as grazing rights. One afternoon, a goat belonging to a shepherd from one village wandered across the hillside and into fields claimed by another. It was, to the animal, nothing more than a patch of grass and a cluster of shrubs. But to the villagers, it was an intrusion. The goat was seized by men from the rival community who demanded compensation. The shepherd, furious, refused. Voices rose. Threats were made. And soon both villages had rallied their young men, armed with sticks, muskets, and pride. What might have been solved with calm words quickly grew into a standoff. Men from each side gathered near the disputed fields, shouting across the dry air. Stones were thrown, shots fired into the sky. The goat, confused, bleated loudly, tethered nearby as though it were the guilty party on trial. The quarrel soon spread. Families took sides. Old grievances were remembered. By nightfall, a simple dispute over a grazing animal had become a small war between neighbors. Local authorities, alarmed by the rising tension, dispatched soldiers to calm the conflict. They found villages barricaded, men posturing with rifles, and the poor goat still bleeding in the background. Through patient mediation, the animal was eventually returned, and compensation was quietly arranged. The militias disbanded. Life returned to its rhythms of farming, shepherding, and market days. The Goat War, as it was remembered, ended not with treaties signed under chandeliers, but with weary nods, muttered apologies, and a goat that wandered back to its hillside pasture. So, dear friend, the Goat War reminds us of how small things, smaller even than a pig or a bucket, can spark flames of conflict when pride is at stake. A single goat, indifferent to borders, managed to draw men into quarrel, to summon weapons, and to unsettle peace. And yet, in the end, the resolution was as small as the cause. No empires fell. No land changed hands. Only pride was bruised, and perhaps the goat a little shaken. As you picture those Mediterranean hillsides, warm with sunlight and dotted with olive trees, you may smile softly at the thought of men nearly at war over a grazing animal. A gentle reminder that sometimes our quarrels say more about us than about the things we fight for. Before we leave the goat war behind, imagine that hillside once more. The goat returned to its pasture, men slowly dispersing, and the wind carrying away the last echoes of their shouts. Next, we journey northward to the cold steppes of Russia, where a curious conflict unfolded not over animals or fruit, but over a single chess game. Yes, dear friend, a chess game. For in the 17th century, a dispute over chess became the spark for a quarrel that grew into something far larger than the board itself. So take a deep breath, relax, and let the Mediterranean breeze fade and prepare to drift into the quiet absurdity of the chess war. The chess war. When a game sparked a clash. As we continue drifting through history's most senseless invasions, we leave behind the sunny hillsides of the Mediterranean and travel deep into the heart of Russia in the 17th century. It was a land of wide rivers, endless steppes, and wooden villages where long winters encouraged games, songs, and quiet pastimes by the fire. And it is here that a quarrel arose not over animals or crops or even land, but over a game. Yes, dear friend, a game of chess. A match between rival nobles grew heated, pride grew sharp, and what began as an argument over pawns and bishops somehow spiraled into armed conflict. This, quietly tucked away in history's corners, became known as the Chess War. In the 1600s, chess was more than a pastime in Russia. It was a mark of education, wit, and refinement. Noblemen played for honor as much as for entertainment, and a victory on the chessboard could be as satisfying as a triumph in court. It was during one long winter evening in a noble's hall lit by candles and warmed by crackling fires that two aristocrats sat down to play. One was a wealthy landowner, proud of his skill. The other, a rival of equal stature, equally determined not to lose. At first, the pieces moved calmly across the board. But as the night stretched on and the game tilted one way, then another, tempers began to rise. One player accused the other of cheating, moving a bishop in a way that defied the rules. The quarrel erupted over one single move. Voices rose. Servants watched uneasily. Accusations of dishonor filled the hall. Neither man would yield. The game ended not with a checkmate, but with a table overturned, pieces scattering across the floor. What might have ended as an insult instead became a challenge. One noble gathered his retainers, armed with muskets and sabers. The other did the same. A game of 32 pieces had become a quarrel of dozens of men. Within days, the quarrel spread beyond the hall. Villagers loyal to each noble took sides. Shots were fired across fields, barns were raided, and small skirmishes broke out in the snow. Imagine this. Peasants and retainers trudging through the frost, armed with axes and rifles, clashing not for land or gold, but for the honor of a chess match. There were no great battles. Instead, there were scattered fights along frozen roads, men shouting insults borrowed from the game itself. Knights, pawns, rooks, all turned into metaphors for pride. In time, the Tsar's officials intervened. The quarrel had grown too loud to ignore, and soldiers were dispatched to restore order. The nobles were summoned to Moscow, scolded for their foolishness, and fined heavily. Their men returned home, muttering about wasted weeks in the cold. And the chessboard? It was said to have been locked away, its pieces untouched, a silent witness to the absurdity it had inspired. So, dear friend, the chess war reminds us of the curious ways pride can transform play into quarrel. A bishop's move, a disputed rule, and suddenly two noble households were at odds, their men skirmishing across snowy fields. It is at once absurd and oddly comforting. Comforting because even in ages of war and empire, humans could still find ways to argue over games, as though the world were not heavy enough already. And perhaps, as you picture that overturned chessboard, pieces scattered on the floor, you may smile softly at the thought of men marching into the snow because of a single misplaced bishop. Before we leave the chess war behind, imagine that frozen village once more. The chessboard gathering dust, while outside life slowly returned to its rhythm. Next, we will journey to Africa, where a quarrel unfolded not over games or goats, but over a flagpole. Yes, dear friend, a flagpole. For in a small colonial outpost, the question of whose flag should fly above it was enough to bring nations into dispute. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let the sound of the chess pieces fade, and prepare to drift onward into the curious tale of the Flagpole War. The Flagpole War, when a banner sparked a dispute. As we continue our slow passage through history's most senseless invasions, we now find ourselves in the age of colonial outposts, in a small settlement on the African coast. The sun is hot, the air heavy, and in the center of the dusty town square rises a single wooden flagpole. And it is here, dear listener, that two nations clashed, not over gold mines, nor fertile fields, nor even territory, but over which flag would fly upon that pole. This, remembered quietly by historians and almost forgotten by the world, came to be known as the Flagpole War. In the late 19th century, during the height of European competition in Africa, it was not unusual for borders to be poorly drawn. Maps, sketched in distant capitals, often overlapped, and sometimes two powers claimed the same patch of land. In one such settlement, little more than a cluster of huts, a market, and a small fort, both the British and the French believed themselves to be the rightful rulers. At the center of it all stood a flagpole. On some days, the British Union Jack fluttered above it. On others, the French tricolor was hoisted in its place. The townspeople, bemused, watched as soldiers from each nation took turns raising and lowering their banners, as though the pole itself were a stage for international theater. One morning, a British officer arranged a ceremony to raise his flag before an assembled crowd. With drums beating and soldiers standing at attention, the Union Jack was lifted skyward. But just as it reached the top, a group of French troops arrived, furious, insisting the pole was theirs. They lowered the British flag, hoisted their own, and marched away. Insults were shouted, tempers flared, and soon the matter of which flag should fly became an affair of national pride. Within days, reinforcements arrived from both sides. The tiny settlement became crowded with soldiers, each determined to see their flag on the pole. At dawn, the British flag was raised. By noon, the French replaced it. By evening, the British returned, repeating the ritual. The flagpole groaned under the strain, its rope worn thin by constant tugging. And while muskets were fired into the air and a few scuffles broke out in the streets, no real battle came. The only true contest was the endless raising and lowering of cloth upon wood. In the end, the governments in London and Paris grew weary of reports about the squabble. Letters were exchanged, treaties reviewed, and lines redrawn on maps. The settlement was awarded to one side. Records differ on which, and the other withdrew, their flag neatly folded, their soldiers grumbling at having marched so far for so little. The flagpole, scarred and crooked from its ordeal, remained behind as a quiet witness to the absurdity. So, dear friend, the Flagpole War reminds us of how human pride can attach itself to symbols. Two nations with all their armies and resources quarreled not over vast riches or mighty fortresses, but over whose fabric fluttered in the wind. And yet, in its very absurdity, it is strangely comforting. For though tempers ran high and muskets were loaded, the only true casualties were ropes, cloth, and dignity. As you imagine that lonely flagpole swaying in the African sun, you may smile softly at the thought of empires nearly undone by a simple piece of wood. Before we leave the Flagpole War behind, picture that crooked pole standing silently in the square, its ropes still frayed, as the townspeople return to their daily lives, unmoved by the banners above them. Next, we will journey once more to South America, where a war was fought not over symbols nor borders, but over droppings of birds. Yes, dear friend, droppings of birds. For in the 19th century, rival nations clashed over the Guano Islands, tiny rocks in the sea, valued only for the droppings of seabirds. So, take a deep breath. Relax. Let the fluttering of flags fade and prepare to drift onward into the curious tale of the Guano War. The Guano War, when bird droppings became treasure. As we continue our quiet voyage through history's most senseless invasions, we now sail to the coast of South America in the mid-19th century. Here, far from the bustling cities and green valleys, lie small, barren islands, rocky outcrops surrounded by the endless sea. They had no gold, no lush fields, no fresh water. And yet they were treasures, not for what lay upon them, but for what lay above them. For the countless seabirds that circled overhead had, over centuries, covered these islands in thick layers of guano, bird droppings. Yes, dear friend, guano. A word not often spoken in lullabies, but in the 19th century, it was worth its weight in gold. This is the story of the Guano War, when nations fought not for riches of the earth, but for the waste of seabirds. In the age before chemical fertilizers, guano was prized beyond measure. Rich in nitrogen, it transformed barren fields into fertile ground. Ships carried it across oceans. Farmers paid dearly for it. To own guano-rich islands was to hold the key to agricultural wealth. And so, tiny rocks in the Pacific became the focus of very serious ambitions. Among these were the Chincha Islands, lying just off the coast of Peru. White, reeking, and thickly layered with guano, they became a resource so valuable that nations quarreled bitterly over them. Peru, newly independent from Spain, claimed the islands as its own. Spain, still nursing wounds from the loss of its empire, insisted otherwise. In 1864, Spanish forces seized the Chincha Islands, raising their flag over the guano-covered rocks. The Peruvians protested fiercely. Neighboring Chile and Ecuador soon joined their cause. What began as a quarrel over bird droppings quickly grew into an international dispute. The irony, of course, is that the islands themselves were nearly uninhabitable. The stench was overwhelming, the heat oppressive, and the only constant sound was the endless caw of seabirds. Yet around these inhospitable rocks, warships gathered. Spanish frigates patrolled the coast. South American vessels prepared to defend their waters. Skirmishes broke out at sea, cannon fire echoing across the waves. Men who had never set foot on the Guano Islands found themselves battling for the right to claim them. By 1866, the quarrel had grown into what came to be called the Chincha Islands War. Navies clashed off the coasts of Chile and Peru. Bombardments struck coastal towns. Sailors fought and died, all while the seabirds continued their endless circling, indifferent to the struggles below. The war raged for 2 years, consuming treasure and lives, all for the right to claim ownership of droppings. In the end, the war burned itself out. Spain, facing resistance far from home, withdrew its forces. Peru and its allies reclaimed the islands, and the guano trade continued. The seabirds, of course, remained the true masters of the islands, replenishing the treasure with every passing year. So, dear friend, the Guano War reminds us of how human ambition can turn even the most unlikely things into objects of desire. That nations would clash, ships would burn, and cannons would roar, all for bird droppings, is both absurd and strangely telling. For in guano lay the promise of food, of prosperity, of fertile fields far across the sea. And so men fought for it, as they had for gold or oil or land. And perhaps as you imagine those lonely islands, white with guano, echoing with the cries of gulls, you may smile gently at the thought that empires quarreled over such a thing. A war where the birds gave freely, while men fought bitterly for the right to shovel it into ships. Before we leave the Guano War behind, picture the Chincha Islands once more. Silent but for the seabirds, their rocky slopes gleaming white beneath the sun, treasures of the earth born from the sky. With this story, we bring our journey through 20 of history's most senseless invasions to a gentle pause. From pigs to buckets, from goats to guano, we have wandered through tales that are at once absurd and quietly human. Reminders that pride, stubbornness, and folly have shaped as much of history as glory and conquest. So, take a deep breath. Relax and let these stories settle softly in your mind, and allow the slow rhythm of history's strangest moments to guide you into rest. I want you to tell me in the comment section which part of the world you are listening from. Let's connect. And which is the most interesting story to you.